Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the second in this three-part series of brief presentations introducing Death in the Compass. If you recall, in the last presentation, we talked a little bit about Death in the Compass as a piece of detective fiction. In this presentation, I wanted to say a few words about Death in the Compass and the idea of symmetry or symmetrical relationships. You've read enough Borges at this point to know that Borges is a great fan of symmetrical relationships, and by symmetrical relationships, I just mean the repetition of identical or similar motifs and patterns at various points in a story. These patterns allow us to draw thematic connections between the various parts of the story. I think that there are three kinds of symmetry that we need to pay attention to as we're reading through Death in the Compass. The first is numerical symmetry. If you've read the story already, you'll know this is absolutely central to the plot and its development. The second is shape symmetry. So as you read, you will notice that certain shapes recur throughout the story at various critical points. And the third is color symmetry. In this presentation, I'm only going to talk about numerical symmetry, and I'll leave it to you as you're reading to sort of think about and discern the other types of symmetry that I've mentioned. So, a numerical symmetry. I want to draw our attention to a passage where Borges insists on the importance of numerical symmetry in Death in the Compass. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see exactly what it is that I'm seeing. So here I have pulled up an electronic version of Death in the Compass. This is the Hurley translation, so it's the translation that we're using in class, although as you can probably tell, the electronic version that I'm using is formatted and paginated slightly differently from the printed version that we're using, but the translation is the same, and so you should be able to follow along no problem. So I want to draw your attention in the printed text to page 147. It's the first page of the story, and we're going to start in the second paragraph, just after the introductory paragraph where the narrator introduces the main characters and gives a little sort of background about the story. In the second paragraph, he begins to describe the first crime, the murder of Marcelo Yarmolinsky. So I want to read a little bit of it with you, and I want us to pay attention to the numbers that occur in this paragraph. So the narrator writes, "The first crime occurred in the Hôtel du Nord, that tall prism sitting high above the estuary whose waters are the color of the desert. To that tower, which is notorious for uniting in itself the abhorrent whiteness of a sanatorium, the numbered divisibility of a prison, and the general appearance of a house of ill repute," a magnificent description of the hotel. In any event, to that tower there came on December 3rd the delegate from Podolsk to the third Talmudic conference, Dr. Marcelo Yarmolinsky, a man of gray beard and gray eyes. We will never know whether he found the Hôtel du Nord to his liking. He accepted it with the ancient resignation that had allowed him to bear 3 years of war in the Carpathians and 3,000 years of pogroms and oppression. He was given a room on our floor, across the hall from the suite occupied, not without some splendor, by the Tetrarch of Galilee. Yarmolinsky had dinner, put off until the next day his examination of the unfamiliar city, set out his many books and very few articles of jewelry on a bureau, and before midnight turned off the light. Thus testified the Tetrarch's driver, who was sleeping in the adjoining room. On the 4th, that is to say on the 4th of December, at 11:30 a.m., a writer for the Yiddische Zeitung telephoned Yarmolinsky, but Dr. Yarmolinsky did not answer. He was found lying on the floor of his room, his face now slightly discolored, his body almost naked beneath an anachronistic cape. Okay, so this is the description the narrator offers of the first murder. And I want to draw our attention to a few themes, a few motifs that recur in this particular section. Now, if you're sort of reading and paying attention, and honestly, if you really weren't paying that much attention, you probably noticed that there are certain numbers that recur throughout the story and throughout the paragraph. And the most obvious and most prominent, of course, is the number 3. We see, for instance, that Yarmolinsky arrives at the conference on the 3rd of December. We also learn that this is the third Talmudic conference. And if you don't know what Talmudic means or what Talmud means, there's a document on Blackboard that describes it very briefly. We also learn a little bit later that Yarmolinsky had endured 3 years of war in the Carpathians and 3,000 years of pogroms and oppression. You know? Near the end of the page, we learn that the writer for the Yiddische Zeitung, which is just a Yiddish newspaper, we learn that the writer from the Yiddische Zeitung called Yarmolinsky at 11:30 a.m. You may be interested to note that in all of the Spanish editions of this text that I've been able to consult, the time given is not 11:30, but 11:03, so 11 and 3 minutes. I'm not entirely sure where Hurley got 11:30, but it's not really that significant, especially since the motif of 3 is preserved in both cases. If we continue, we will also notice that the motif of 3ness reappears at the end of this paragraph, where we are introduced to the secondary character Treviranus. Treviranus is sort of the deputy detective, Lonrat's sidekick. Treviranus, as you may have already noticed, has the word 3 in his name, tres, 3 in both Latin and in Spanish. The second half of Treviranus' name, Viranus, comes from the Latin word vir, or vir, and it just means man. So Treviranus means something like the 3-man or the 3rd man or something like that. At the beginning of the next paragraph, the motif of 3ness recurs again, although if you didn't or can't read the story in Spanish, you probably won't have caught it. So the first line uttered, the first bit of dialogue uttered by Treviranus is, in the English translation, "No need to go off on wild goose chases here." This is a perfectly adequate translation, but if we consult the Spanish original, which I've pulled up here, we'll see that the line in question, the first line uttered by Treviranus, I have it highlighted, is "No hay que buscarle tres pies al gato." Now, in Spanish, literally, this line means there's no reason, there's no need to look for 3 legs or 3 feet on a cat. And literally, of course, it's practically nonsensical. It's an idiomatic or colloquial expression that means something like, no need to create extra problems for ourselves, no need to engage in an endeavor that's likely to be fruitless, no need to go on wild goose chases. But in Spanish, the expression contains this word 3. So again, sort of reiterating the motif of 3ness. So that's on the one hand. With this in mind, with this sort of insistent repetition of 3 in a single paragraph, in the first part of the third paragraph, I want you to pay attention to recurrences of 3 throughout the story. What role do they play? Are they significant in any sense? In addition to 3, there's also a bit of additional numerical symmetry that is important in the paragraph we just read through. So 3 is absolutely central. It's the key numerical symbol. But there are also multiple references to the number 4. So, for instance, at the end of the page in my electronic edition, we learn that while Yarmolinsky arrived at the Congress on the 3rd of December, the writer from the Yiddische Zeitung calls him on the 4th of December. Earlier in the paragraph, we had also learned, just here, that Yarmolinsky occupied a room on our floor, across the hall from the suite occupied by the Tetrarch of Galilee. The Tetrarch of Galilee. Now, the Tetrarch of Galilee is not exactly a fictional reference. There was a Tetrarch of Galilee, and you've almost certainly heard of him. The Tetrarch of Galilee was the title given to Herod Antipas. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you will know that Herod Antipas is the Herod that is associated with the beheading of John the Baptist. He's also associated with the events leading up to the execution of Jesus. Now, his title was Tetrarch of Galilee. Tetrarch of Galilee. The word tetrarch comes from 2 Greek words. So the second bit of the word, arch, comes from the Greek word arche, which can mean various things. It can mean old, but in this case, it means ruler or command. The first half of the word tetra or tet comes from the Greek word tetera or tetere. And tetere in Greek just means 4 or a 4th. If you've ever played the computer game Tetris, you may be familiar with this idea, though in Tetris, all the various shapes are composed of 4 individual blocks. That's why it's called Tetris. Anyway, the Tetrarch of Galilee, a tetrarch in general, is a person who is in command or control or has leadership responsibilities for a fourth of a region. So the Tetrarch of Galilee in this case is Herod Antipas, who was the son, and not to be confused with another famous Herod from the New Testament, Herod the Great. Herod the Great is or was the king of this region, who is mentioned at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. So if you remember, when the wise men come to see Jesus and they go to see Herod, and he says, "Oh, I need to know where Jesus is born so that I can go worship him as well." That's Herod the Great, not Herod Antipas, not the Tetrarch of Galilee, but related nonetheless. So here again, in the reference to the Tetrarch of Galilee, we have a kind of repetition of the motif of fourness. Now, as you're reading through the story, you will see other references to fourness. Most critically, I think, in the word tetragrammaton, which is going to play a critical role in the story as well. If you don't know what the tetragrammaton is, there's a document on Blackboard that describes it in some detail. So what I'd like you to do as you're reading through the story, to think carefully, to pay close attention to the repetition of fourness, the motif of fourness. Where does it occur? How does it occur? It won't always be explicit, like the 4th of December. Sometimes it'll be veiled and obscured, like the Tetrarch of Galilee. In other cases, you'll have to pay attention to shapes. So the narrator mentions a variety of shapes in the text, and some of those shapes, if you think about them, you will discover that they have 4 sides. So think about that as you're reading through the text. Okay, so I hope that gives you a sense of just one of the things that you ought to look for as you're reading the text: numerical symmetry, shape symmetry, and then, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, color symmetry. Pay attention to those things, and I think it will increase your comprehension of the story, and so also your enjoyment of the story. Very well. Well, that's all for the moment, and I hope you enjoy the story. We will be in touch. Please let me know if you have any questions.